The crystal spires of the Zephyrian imperial palace reached toward the twin suns like giant fingers grasping for divine power. Empress Vexithara stood on her private balcony, her 6 arms folded in contemplation as she watched the morning light dance across the cityscape below. Her chitinous exoskeleton gleamed with a deep purple hue that marked her as royalty among her people, and the neural crown upon her elongated head pulsed with soft blue light as she processed the morning reports. Today would be different. Today she would leave her palace for the first time in 3 cycles to attend the Grand Council of Species on the neutral station of Harmony Prime. The gathering happened only once every 50 standard years, bringing together the leaders of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations to discuss trade, territory, and the delicate balance of power that kept their corner of space relatively peaceful. "Mother?" The voice was small, uncertain. Vexithara turned to see her son, Prince Kirion, standing in the doorway. At only 12 cycles old, he was still growing into his exoskeleton, which appeared too large for his thin frame. His neural crown was barely developed, showing only the faintest flicker of the intelligence that would one day make him a worthy successor. "What troubles you, my child?" Vexithara's voice carried the harmonic undertones that marked formal speech among the Zephyrians, but her tone was gentle. "The servants say you will be gone for many days. They say the council is dangerous, that other species will try to trick you or make you weak." Kirion's 4 smaller arms fidgeted nervously, while his 2 primary arms remained stiffly at his sides, as protocol demanded. Vexithara approached her son, lowering herself to his eye level. In private moments like these, she allowed herself to show the affection that public life rarely permitted. "The council is indeed challenging, my son. But our people have led this sector for 300 cycles because we are wise, strong, and adaptable. I go not from weakness, but to ensure our strength continues." She touched his neural crown gently, feeling the developing pathways of his young mind. "While I am gone, you must continue your studies. The tutors will maintain your lessons in mathematics, stellar navigation, and diplomatic protocol. You will also continue your physical training with Commander Yextal." "Yes, Mother." Kirion's voice carried resignation, but also something else. "What about the human?" Vexithara paused. The human. She had almost forgotten about that particular oddity in her household. 3 years ago, a human trading vessel had suffered catastrophic engine failure near their system. Most of the crew had been rescued by passing merchant ships, but one had been left behind, unconscious and badly injured. Rather than simply disposing of the primitive alien as protocol would normally dictate, Vexithara had been curious enough to have him treated and brought to the palace. The human called himself Jack Morrison. He claimed to have been a maintenance engineer on his ship, though his knowledge seemed to extend far beyond simple mechanical work. When it became clear that no rescue was coming for him and returning him to human space would require significant resources, Vexithara had made a practical decision. He could work as a maintenance worker in the palace, earning his keep while serving as an interesting specimen for study. What surprised her was how well the arrangement had worked. Jack was incredibly adaptable, learning their basic language within months and developing an intuitive understanding of their technology. More importantly, he seemed genuinely grateful for his situation rather than resentful, displaying none of the aggressive tendencies that Zephyrian intelligence reports suggested were typical of human psychology. "What about the human, my son? May I speak with him while you are away? The tutors and Commander Yextal are very serious." "Sometimes I grow tired of being serious all the time." Kirion's admission was barely above a whisper, as if confessing a shameful weakness. Vexithara considered this request. On one hand, it was highly irregular for a prince to associate with a servant, especially an alien one. On the other hand, she had observed Jack's interactions with the palace staff and found them consistently respectful and appropriate. He showed proper deference to rank while maintaining a curious friendliness that seemed to put others at ease. More importantly, she had noticed something troubling in her son lately. Despite receiving the finest education available in their empire, Kirion seemed to lack the natural curiosity and creative thinking that would serve him well as a future leader. His tutors complained that while he memorized lessons perfectly, he struggled to apply knowledge in new situations. He followed protocol flawlessly but showed little initiative. These were serious concerns for an heir who would one day need to navigate the complex challenges of ruling an interstellar empire. Perhaps exposure to an alien perspective might stimulate the kind of thinking that traditional education had failed to develop. Very well, she decided. You may speak with the human during your free periods, but remember, he is still a servant. You will treat him with appropriate dignity but maintain proper boundaries, and your regular studies remain your priority. Kirion's neural crown flickered brighter with excitement. Thank you, Mother. I promise to maintain my studies and observe all protocols. See that you do. Vexthara straightened to her full imposing height. Now, I must attend to final preparations. The transport leaves within the hour. The next hour passed in a whirlwind of activity. Vexithara's personal staff loaded her transport with everything needed for the journey to Harmony Prime. Diplomatic gifts, ceremonial robes, communication equipment, and security briefings filled her time until she barely had a moment to bid her son farewell. Remember your duties, she told him as they stood in the palace's main launching bay. Remember your heritage, and remember that everything you do reflects upon our people. I will make you proud, Mother. You already do, my son. Now, make yourself proud as well. With that, Empress Vexithara boarded her transport and departed for the Grand Council, leaving Prince Kirion alone with his thoughts, his studies, and a human janitor who was about to change his understanding of the universe in ways she could never have imagined. Jack Morrison pushed his maintenance cart through the lower levels of the palace, whistling an old earth tune that echoed softly off the crystal walls. 3 years of living among the Zephyrians had taught him to appreciate the elegant architecture of their buildings, all flowing curves and organic shapes that seemed to grow naturally from the ground rather than being constructed. It was beautiful in its way, though he sometimes missed the angular, defiant geometry of human structures. He was checking the atmospheric recycling systems on level 7 when he heard footsteps approaching. The cadence was familiar but unexpected in this part of the palace. Turning, he saw Prince Kirion approaching, flanked by 2 guards who looked decidedly uncomfortable about being in the maintenance levels. Jack immediately set down his tools and performed the proper greeting, lowering himself to one knee and extending his arms in the gesture of respect he had learned during his first weeks here. Your Highness honors these humble corridors with his presence. Rise, Jack Morrison. The young prince's voice carried the beginning traces of the harmonic undertones that would develop as he matured. I hoped I might find you here. Jack stood, noting the nervous fidgeting of the prince's smaller arms. In 3 years of occasional interactions, he had learned to read Zephyrian body language reasonably well. The kid was anxious about something. How may I serve you, Your Highness? My mother has departed for the Grand Council. She said I might speak with you during my free periods if it would not interfere with your duties. This was interesting. Jack had occasionally exchanged pleasantries with the prince when their paths crossed, but they had never had anything approaching a real conversation. The Empress was clearly very protective of her son, and Jack had always been careful to maintain appropriate distance. I would be honored by your conversation, Your Highness. However, I should point out that I am currently working on atmospheric systems that require attention. Oh. The disappointment in the prince's voice was obvious. I did not mean to interrupt important work. Jack glanced at his diagnostic tablet. The systems were all running normally, and his scheduled maintenance could easily be delayed without any problems. More importantly, there was something in the young prince's demeanor that reminded him of his nephew back on Earth. A bright kid who was hungry for attention and new experiences, but surrounded by adults who were too busy or too formal to really engage with him. Actually, Your Highness, if you are truly interested, this work could perhaps serve as an educational opportunity. The atmospheric systems are quite fascinating from an engineering perspective. Kirion's neural crown flickered with interest. You would teach me about the systems? If Your Highness desires, and if your guards approve. Jack looked to the two Zephyrian soldiers, who exchanged uncertain glances. They were clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but had no specific orders that would prevent it. One of the guards activated his communication device and spoke in rapid, formal Zephyrian too complex for Jack to follow completely. After a brief conversation, he nodded to the prince. The palace protocols permit educational activities during your free periods, Your Highness. We will observe and ensure your safety. Excellent, Jack said, retrieving his tools. Now then, Your Highness, what do you know about how this palace maintains breathable atmosphere for all its inhabitants? For the next 2 hours, Jack found himself giving an impromptu engineering lesson to one of the most powerful beings in the sector. What surprised him was how quickly the prince grasped not just the technical concepts, but the underlying principles. When Jack explained how the recycling systems had to account for the different respiratory needs of various species who visited the palace, Kirion immediately began asking questions about efficiency optimization and backup procedures. So, if the primary scrubbers failed, the prince mused, the backup systems would need to handle the full load. But you said the backups are only designed for 60% capacity. That seems inadequate. An excellent observation, Your Highness. What would you suggest? Kirion's smaller arms, moved in patterns Jack had learned, indicated deep thought. Perhaps we could modify the system so that in an emergency, non-essential areas could be sealed off, concentrating the backup capacity where it is most needed. That's exactly right. In fact, I proposed a similar modification to the chief engineer last year. Was it implemented? Well, Jack hesitated, then decided honesty was the best policy. The chief engineer felt that modifications proposed by a human servant were unlikely to be reliable. Kirion's neural crown flickered in what Jack had learned was confusion or surprise. But if the idea was sound, why would it matter who proposed it? And there it was. The question that cut right to the heart of so many problems Jack had observed in Zephyrian society. How to explain to this young prince that even an advanced civilization could be limited by prejudice and rigid thinking. Your Highness, may I ask you a question? Of course. In your studies, have you learned about how your people first developed space travel? Yes. Our greatest scientists and engineers worked for generations to overcome the challenges of interstellar flight. They built upon the knowledge of those who came before, always seeking to improve and advance. And were these scientists and engineers all members of the noble class? Kirion paused, his neural crown flickering as he processed this unexpected question. No. Our histories speak of contributions from all levels of society. The breakthrough in quantum tunnel drives came from a sanitation worker who observed an unusual resonance pattern in waste processing equipment. So innovation and good ideas can come from anywhere? Yes, but Kirion stopped, and Jack could almost see the wheels turning in the young alien's mind. But that was long ago. Surely our society has advanced beyond needing insights from servants? From aliens? From people who don't fit the traditional patterns? The prince fell silent, staring at the atmospheric processing unit they had been examining. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer than before. Jack Morrison, may I ask you something personal? Of course, Your Highness. Are you happy here? In the palace, I mean? Serving my people? It was Jack's turn to pause. How do you explain to a child born into ultimate privilege that happiness is often about making the best of your circumstances, finding purpose where you can, and focusing on what you can control rather than what you can't? Your Highness, 3 years ago I was drifting in space in a damaged ship, certain I was going to die. Your mother saved my life and gave me a chance to be useful again. Yes, I am far from my home and my family. Yes, I sometimes feel lonely or frustrated. But I am alive. I am learning amazing things every day, and I am able to contribute something meaningful to this place. That seems like enough reasons to be grateful, if not always happy. But don't you wish you could go home? Every day. But wishing for things you cannot change is a waste of energy that could be better spent improving things you can change. Kirion considered this for a long moment. Is that a human philosophy? Jack chuckled. I suppose it is, in a way. We have a saying on Earth, bloom where you are planted. It means that instead of spending all your time wishing you were somewhere else, you should try to make the most of where you actually are. Bloom where you are planted, the prince repeated slowly, testing the unfamiliar concept. But what if where you are planted is not where you belong? Well, Your Highness, that assumes you know where you belong. Maybe the place you're planted is exactly where you need to be, even if it's not where you expected to be. As Jack packed up his tools, he noticed that the prince had grown very quiet, his neural crown showing the slow, steady pulse that indicated deep contemplation. The guards, meanwhile, looked like they were having serious second thoughts about this entire interaction. Your Highness, I should return to my duties, and I suspect your tutors will be expecting you soon. Yes, you are right. Kirion straightened to his full height, resuming the formal posture expected of royalty. Thank you for the lesson, Jack Morrison. It was illuminating. The honor was mine, Your Highness. As the prince and his guards departed, Jack found himself wondering what exactly had just happened. He had the distinct feeling that he had just set something in motion, though he couldn't say what. The young prince was clearly intelligent and curious, but there had been something else in his questions, a kind of searching that went beyond simple intellectual interest. Well, whatever it wasn't really his business. He was just a maintenance worker who happened to have answered some questions about atmospheric systems. Nothing more, nothing less. Or so he thought. The next few days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Prince Kirion would dutifully attend his morning lessons with his tutors, practice combat forms with Commander Yextal in the afternoon, and then seek out Jack during his evening free periods. What had begun as a simple conversation about atmospheric systems had evolved into something much more significant. Jack found himself looking forward to these interactions as much as the prince seemed to. It had been a long time since he'd had someone genuinely interested in learning, someone who asked questions not to test his knowledge but out of real curiosity about how things worked. On the third day, they were examining the palace's water reclamation facility when Kirion posed a question that stopped Jack cold. Jack Morrison, why do your people fight so much? Jack looked up from the filtration controls he'd been explaining. I'm sorry, Your Highness. In our intelligence briefings about human space, there are many references to conflicts, wars between your nations, civil disputes, resource conflicts. Your species seems to spend enormous amounts of energy fighting itself instead of working together toward common goals. Why is this? It was a fair question, and not one that Jack could answer easily. How do you explain the complexities of human nature to an alien prince whose people had achieved unity through thousands of years of rigid hierarchy? That's That's a complicated question, Your Highness. May I ask why you're curious about it? Kirion's smaller arms fidgeted, a habit Jack had noticed when the prince was wrestling with difficult thoughts. I have been thinking about what you said, about blooming where you are planted. But if humans fight so much, how do you ever know where you truly belong? Jack sat back on his heels, setting down his diagnostic tool. This was clearly not a conversation about water reclamation anymore. Your Highness, may I tell you a story? Please. When I was young, about your age, I lived in a city where there were two main groups of people. They had different religions, different traditions, and they had been fighting for generations over who had the right to control certain neighborhoods. My family belonged to one group, and I was taught from childhood that the other group was dangerous, that they hated us and wanted to destroy our way of life. Kirion's neural crown pulsed with interest. What happened? When I was 14, there was a terrible accident. A building collapsed during a storm, trapping people inside. Without thinking about which group they belonged to, everyone started digging. I found myself working next to a boy from the other group. His name was Ahmed. We worked for hours together, pulling debris, sharing water, helping carry injured people to safety. And you discovered that he was not your enemy? More than that. I discovered that he was just like me. He was scared, he was tired, he wanted to help people, and he missed his family. The things that made us different were so much smaller than the things that made us the same. Jack paused, remembering that day with surprising clarity. Ahmed and I became friends after that. But here's the important part. Our friendship didn't end the conflict. Most of our communities still saw each other as enemies. Change happens slowly, one person at a time. But that seems so inefficient, Kirion protested. If your people can see that cooperation works better than conflict, why don't your leaders simply order everyone to cooperate? And there it was, the fundamental difference between human and Zephyrian thinking laid bare. Jack chose his next words carefully. Your Highness, can you order someone to trust you? Of course, I am a prince. People trust me because of my position and authority. But is that really trust or is it obedience? Kirion fell silent, his neural crown flickering rapidly as he processed this distinction. Let me ask you this, Jack continued. Do you trust me? Yes. Yes. I think I do. Why? Because you have been honest with me. Because you answer my questions thoughtfully. Because you treat me like a person, not just a title. Exactly. You trust me because of my actions, not because someone ordered you to. Real trust has to be earned. It can't be commanded. But that would mean... Kirion's voice trailed off as the implications hit him. It means that lasting cooperation between groups requires understanding and respect, not just orders from above. And humans fight so much because we're still learning how to build that understanding across our differences. They worked in silence for a while, Kirion clearly deep in thought. Finally, he spoke again. Jack Morrison, I have another question. Ask away. Our tutors teach us that the Zephyrian Empire is strong because we have clear hierarchies and everyone knows their place. They say that species like humans are weak because you lack proper social order. But if that is true, why are human ships found in every corner of the galaxy? Why do humans explore and trade and build things in places where other species fear to go? Jack paused his work entirely. This was dangerous territory. Criticizing the Zephyrian social order, even indirectly, could be seen as sedition. But the prince was clearly struggling with genuine questions about leadership and society. Your Highness, what do you think makes someone a good leader? Knowledge, strength, proper breeding, adherence to protocol, Kirion recited automatically. Those are certainly important. But let me ask you something else. In your studies, have you learned about Admiral Zex Hara, who led the expedition that discovered the Kythera system? Of course, she was my great-great-grandmother. Her discovery of the Kythera mining worlds was one of the foundations of our current prosperity. Do you know how she made that discovery? Kirion's neural crown flickered with confusion. She followed standard exploration protocols and systematic surveying procedures. Jack shook his head. That's what the official histories say. But I had access to the original mission reports when I was working on the Palace Archives digitization project. Admiral Zex Hera made that discovery because she ignored the systematic survey plan. What? The mission was supposed to survey a specific region of space in a predetermined pattern. But Admiral Zex Hera noticed something unusual in the background radiation readings that didn't fit the pattern. Instead of following protocol, she changed course to investigate an anomaly that the mission planners had classified as unimportant. Kirion stared at him. You're saying she succeeded by breaking the rules? I'm saying she succeeded by thinking for herself, by being curious about things that didn't fit the expected pattern, by being willing to take a calculated risk based on her own judgment. But that's... Kirion struggled with the concept. That's not how leadership works. Leaders follow the wisdom of those who came before. They maintain order and stability. Sometimes, but sometimes, Your Highness, leaders have to make new paths. Over the next few days, their conversations ranged far beyond maintenance systems. Jack found himself sharing stories about human exploration, about the messy, chaotic, often dangerous way humans approached problems. He told Kirion about the invention of flight by two bicycle mechanics who ignored the established experts. He described the discovery of antibiotics by a scientist who noticed something unexpected in a contaminated laboratory sample. He explained how human art and music often came from people who broke traditional rules to create something entirely new. In return, Kirion began sharing his own frustrations with his education and his role as heir to the Empire. He confided his fear that he would never be the leader his people needed, that he lacked the natural authority and confidence that seemed to come so easily to his mother. The tutors say, "I think too much," Kirion admitted one evening as they worked on calibrating environmental sensors. They say a true leader should trust in established wisdom rather than questioning everything. But what do you think, Your Highness? I think there is wisdom in tradition, but also danger in never questioning whether old ways are still the best ways. Jack nodded. That's very insightful. Can I ask you something? Always. If you could change one thing about how your empire operates, what would it be? Kirion was quiet for so long that Jack wondered if he had pushed too far. Finally, the prince spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I would want people to feel free to share their ideas, even if those ideas were different or unexpected. I think we might be missing important solutions because we only listen to voices that sound familiar. That's a profound observation, Your Highness. But it's also probably naive. The Empire has existed for thousands of years precisely because we maintain order and tradition. Who am I to think that my ideas could improve on centuries of wisdom? You're someone with a fresh perspective, someone who's had the chance to learn from different sources and ask different questions. That's not naive. That's valuable. On the 7th day of the Empress's absence, something unexpected happened. Prince Kirion arrived for their usual meeting, but instead of going to examine some piece of palace infrastructure, he led Jack to a different part of the building entirely. Where are we going, Your Highness? I want to show you something I've been working on. They arrived at a laboratory facility that Jack had never seen before, filled with sophisticated equipment and multiple workstations. At one of the stations, Kirion pulled up a complex schematic on a holographic display. Remember when you told me about your proposed modifications to the atmospheric backup systems? Yes. I've been thinking about that problem. Not just the atmospheric systems, but emergency response in general. Look at this. The hologram showed a three-dimensional model of the palace, but overlaid with additional systems and pathways that Jack didn't recognize. "I've designed a comprehensive emergency response network," Kirion explained, his voice growing more confident as he talked about his work. "Instead of having separate backup systems for atmosphere, water, power, and communications, everything is integrated. In an emergency, the system automatically reconfigures itself to prioritize the most critical needs." Jack studied the display, his respect for the young prince growing rapidly. The design was elegant, efficient, and showed exactly the kind of innovative thinking that Kirion's tutors claimed to value but seemed unable to encourage. "This is brilliant, Your Highness. The resource allocation algorithms alone represent a significant advance over current systems." "That's not the best part." Kirion manipulated the display, highlighting certain components. "The system is designed to accept input from anyone in the palace, regardless of rank. A maintenance worker who notices an unusual vibration pattern, a cook who observes changes in water quality, a guard who spots structural damage. Anyone can feed information into the system, and it will automatically evaluate and respond to potential problems." Jack felt a chill of recognition. "Your Highness, do you realize what you've created here? An improved emergency response system? You've created a system that values input from every person in the palace based on the quality of their observations, not their social status. You've designed a way for your empire to benefit from the knowledge and insights of everyone, not just the traditional authority figures." Kirion's neural crown pulsed brightly. Yes, I suppose I have. This is revolutionary thinking, Your Highness. This could change how your entire empire operates." "Do you really think so?" "I think your mother is going to be very surprised when she returns." As if summoned by his words, a communication alert chimed throughout the palace. The Empress was returning early from the Grand Council, and she would be arriving within the hour. Kirion's confident demeanor suddenly evaporated. "Oh no. What if she disapproves? What if she thinks I've been wasting my time instead of focusing on proper studies?" "Your Highness," Jack said gently, "do you believe in what you've created here?" "Yes." "Do you think it could help your people?" "Yes." "Then trust yourself. Show her what you've learned, not just what you've built. Show her how you've grown." As they made their way back toward the main levels of the palace, Jack couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. He had come here as a stranded alien, expected to blend into the background and perform simple maintenance tasks. Instead, he had somehow become part of a young prince's education in leadership and innovation. The Empress was going to be shocked, all right, but probably not in the way anyone expected. Empress Vexithara's transport settled onto the palace landing platform with barely a whisper, its advanced propulsion systems demonstrating the elegant efficiency that had made Zephyrian technology the envy of dozens of worlds. As she emerged from the craft, her 6 arms moved in practiced patterns, dismissing her traveling guard and accepting status reports from the palace staff who had gathered to welcome her return. The Grand Council had been challenging. More challenging than she had expected, and in ways that still troubled her. The traditional power structures that had maintained galactic stability for centuries were showing signs of strain. Younger species were demanding greater representation, questioning the authority of established empires and proposing radical changes to long-standing agreements. Most disturbing of all had been the humans. When Vexithara had first encountered them decades ago, they had been a minor species operating on the far edges of civilized space, curious, energetic, but ultimately insignificant. Now, somehow, they had managed to establish themselves as power brokers in half a dozen sectors, not through military conquest or technological superiority, but through something far more unsettling, They had become indispensable. Human traders showed up in the most unlikely places, offering solutions to problems that other species hadn't even recognized they had. Human engineers worked on projects throughout the galaxy, bringing unconventional approaches that somehow produced remarkable results. Human diplomats had an uncanny ability to find common ground between species that had been in conflict for generations. At the Council, it had been a human representative who had proposed the solution to a territorial dispute that had stymied negotiators for months. The proposal had been so elegantly simple, so obviously correct once explained, that Vexthara found herself wondering why no one else had thought of it. But perhaps most unsettling was the realization that her own empire, for all its power and stability, was beginning to feel stagnant. While other species adapted and evolved their approaches to governance and technology, the Zephyrians continued to rely on methods that had worked for centuries but might not be adequate for the challenges ahead. These troubling thoughts occupied her mind as she made her way through the palace corridors toward her private chambers. She needed time to review the detailed reports from the council, to analyze the implications of what she had observed, and to plan her empire's response to a galaxy that was changing faster than she had anticipated. "Your Imperial Majesty." She turned to see Commander Yextal approaching, his formal salute crisp and precise as always. But there was something in his bearing that suggested unusual circumstances. "Commander, I trust there were no significant incidents during my absence." "None, Your Majesty. However, there have been some developments involving Prince Kirion that you should be aware of." Vexthara's neural crown pulsed with concern. "What kind of developments?" "Perhaps it would be better if His Highness explained personally. He has requested an audience with you at your earliest convenience. Is he well? Has there been an accident?" "He is in perfect health, Your Majesty. In fact, he seems energized, more focused and confident than I have observed in some time." This was unexpected. Kirion's usual reaction to her absences was anxiety and withdrawal, not energy and confidence. "Where is he?" "In the main conference chamber, Your Majesty. He said he has something important to show you." Minutes later, Vexithara entered the conference chamber to find a scene that stopped her cold. Her son stood at the head of the great table, no longer fidgeting or showing the nervous habits that had concerned her for months. His posture was erect, his neural crown pulsing with steady confidence, and his voice carried new authority as he spoke to a gathering of the palace's senior staff. "The integration protocols need to be tested under controlled conditions before full implementation, but the preliminary simulations show efficiency improvements of 37% over current systems." Chief Engineer Kexishan, one of the most senior technical advisors in the palace, was studying a holographic display with obvious fascination. "Your Highness, these resource allocation algorithms are remarkably sophisticated. Where did you develop this approach?" "I've been studying our current emergency response procedures and noticed several areas where improvements were possible," Kirion replied. "The key insight was that our existing systems treat each emergency type as a separate problem, when in reality they're all interconnected." Vexithara stepped fully into the chamber, and the assembled staff immediately performed the formal greeting due to the Empress. But her attention was focused entirely on her son, who turned to face her with an expression she had never seen before: quiet confidence mixed with genuine excitement. "Mother, welcome home. I hope the council sessions were productive." "They were enlightening." Vexithara approached the holographic display that had been commanding everyone's attention. "What is this that you've been working on?" For the next 20 minutes, Kirion walked her through his emergency response system design. As he spoke, Vexithara found herself experiencing a mixture of pride and bewilderment. The technical work was impressive, more than impressive. It was genuinely innovative in ways that her son's previous studies had never suggested he was capable of. But more striking was the change in his demeanor. Gone was the uncertain boy who memorized lessons without truly understanding them. In his place stood a young leader who clearly understood not just what he had built, but why it mattered. The most important feature, Kirion explained, highlighting a particular component of the system, is that it accepts and evaluates input from any source. A maintenance worker's observation carries the same weight as a senior engineer's report because the system judges information based on accuracy and relevance, not on the status of the person providing it. Vexathara's neural crown flickered with surprise. That's a very unconventional approach, but a logical one, I think. After all, the person closest to a problem is often the first to notice when something is wrong, regardless of their official position. Chief Engineer Kexashan nodded enthusiastically. Your Highness is absolutely correct. I've reviewed the technical specifications, and this design could revolutionize our approach to infrastructure management. As the presentation concluded and the staff dispersed, Vexathara found herself alone with her son for the first time since her return. The confidence he had displayed during the presentation remained, but she could sense an underlying nervousness as he waited for her private reaction. Kirion, this work is remarkable, but I'm curious about how you developed these ideas. They represent a significant departure from your usual approach to problem solving. I've had some interesting conversations while you were away, Mother. Oh? With your tutors? Well, yes, but also with Jack Morrison. The human. Vexathara should have known. I see. And what did Jack Morrison teach you about engineering emergency response systems? He didn't teach me engineering exactly. He taught me about thinking. Explain. Kirion took a deep breath, his smaller arms moving in the patterns that indicated careful consideration of his words. Mother, do you know why humans explore so much of the galaxy despite being a relatively new spacefaring species? I assume because they are driven by curiosity and lack the wisdom to recognize danger. Jack Morrison told me stories about human explorers and inventors. They often succeeded not because they followed established procedures, but because they were willing to look at old problems in new ways. They asked questions like, what if we tried this differently? Instead of, what is the correct protocol? Vexathara felt a chill of recognition. These were exactly the kinds of questions that the human representative at the council had been asking, questions that had led to solutions no one else had considered. And you think this approach has value? I think it has helped me become a better student and a better future leader. Instead of just memorizing what others have done, I'm learning to think about what might be possible. But tradition and established wisdom exist for good reasons, my son. The methods that have served our people for centuries shouldn't be abandoned lightly. I agree completely, Kirion said, surprising her. But Jack Morrison also taught me something else. He said that the strongest buildings use both old stones and new ones. The old stones provide the foundation, but new stones allow the building to grow taller and stronger. Vexathara stared at her son, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. The nervous child was gone, replaced by a thoughtful young adult who had somehow learned to balance respect for tradition with openness to innovation. Tell me more about these conversations with Jack Morrison. Over the next hour, Kirion shared the stories Jack had told him, the questions they had explored together, and the insights he had gained about leadership, innovation, and the value of listening to diverse perspectives. As she listened, Vexathara found herself thinking about the challenges she had observed at the Grand Council, the need for fresh approaches to complex problems, and the possibility that her empire's greatest strength, its stability and hierarchy, might also be a hidden weakness. Mother, may I ask you about the council? What would you like to know? Did our traditional approaches serve us well? Were you able to achieve the outcomes our people need? It was a perceptive question, and one that went straight to the heart of her concerns. How to explain to her son that their empire's methods, while effective in the past, might not be sufficient for the challenges ahead? The galaxy is changing, Kirion. The problems we face are becoming more complex, and the solutions that worked for our ancestors may not always work for us. Then perhaps we need to learn new ways of thinking about solutions? Perhaps we do. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Vexithara spoke again. Your emergency response system, you believe it could be implemented throughout the Empire? With modifications for different environments and needs, yes. But more importantly, the underlying principles could be applied to many other challenges we face. What principles do you mean? Valuing good ideas regardless of their source, encouraging people to share their observations and insights, building systems that can adapt to new situations instead of just following predetermined patterns. Vexithara's neural crown pulsed rapidly as she considered the implications. What her son was describing wasn't just a technical innovation, it was a fundamental reimagining of how their society could function. These are profound ideas, my son, but implementing them would require significant changes in how we govern and how our people think about authority and social structure. Yes, Kirion agreed. But Jack Morrison told me something that I think applies here. He said that lasting change happens gradually, one person at a time. We don't have to transform the entire empire overnight. We could start small, test new approaches, and expand them as we learn what works. And you believe this human janitor's perspective on social change is reliable? Kirion's neural crown flickered with what might have been amusement. I believe Jack Morrison's perspective is valuable because he's had to adapt to completely new circumstances and find ways to be useful, despite being far from everything familiar. That experience has taught him things about resilience and innovation that someone who never leaves their comfortable environment might never learn. Even if that environment is a royal palace? Especially if that environment is a royal palace. As the conversation continued, Vexithara found herself reconsidering not just her son's education, but her entire approach to leadership. The human's influence on Kirion had been profound, but it hadn't made him rebellious or disrespectful of tradition. Instead, it had helped him develop exactly the kind of balanced thinking that would serve him well as a future emperor. More than that, the ideas he was exploring might be exactly what their empire needed to remain strong and relevant in a rapidly changing galaxy. Kirion, I want to meet with Jack Morrison. You want to speak with him? Why? Because anyone who can help my son develop from an uncertain student into a confident, innovative thinker is someone I need to understand better. An hour later, Jack Morrison stood in the Empress's private study, maintaining the respectful posture required of a servant, but feeling considerably more nervous than he had during any of his conversations with the prince. Empress Vexithara was an imposing figure under the best of circumstances, and right now she was studying him with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. Jack Morrison, my son tells me that you have taught him about human approaches to problem-solving and innovation. I've shared some stories and perspectives, Your Imperial Majesty, but Prince Kirion's insights and innovations are entirely his own. Perhaps. But those innovations represent a significant departure from his previous work. I'm curious about what kind of influence led to such changes. Jack chose his words carefully. Your Majesty, your son is remarkably intelligent and curious. I think he was always capable of this kind of thinking. He just needed encouragement to trust his own judgment and consider new possibilities. And you provided that encouragement by sharing human stories about exploration and innovation? I shared some examples of how humans have approached challenges throughout our history, but more importantly, I listened to his questions and tried to help him think through the implications of his observations. Vexathara was quiet for a long moment, her neural crown pulsing in patterns Jack couldn't read. Finally, she spoke again. "Jack Morrison, at the Grand Council, I observed something that troubled me. Other species, particularly humans, seem to be adapting to new challenges with remarkable speed and effectiveness. Meanwhile, my empire, for all its power and stability, sometimes feels rigid, unable to respond to unexpected situations with the flexibility that these new challenges require." Jack wasn't sure how to respond to such an admission from the most powerful being in the sector. "Your Majesty, every society has strengths and challenges. The Zephyrian Empire has achieved remarkable stability and prosperity. That's no small accomplishment. But is stability enough? If the galaxy continues to change as rapidly as it has been, will our traditional approaches be sufficient to maintain our strength and prosperity?" It was a profound question, and one that Jack suspected had no easy answer. But perhaps that was exactly the point. "Your Majesty, I think the key might be learning to balance stability with adaptability, keeping the foundations that have made your empire strong while remaining open to new ideas that could make it even stronger. Rather like using both old stones and new stones to build a stronger building?" Jack smiled slightly, recognizing his own metaphor. "Yes, Your Majesty. Exactly like that. Jack Morrison, I have a proposition for you. Your Majesty, my son has benefited greatly from exposure to your perspective. I believe our empire might benefit similarly. I would like you to continue working with Kirion, not just as a conversation partner, but as a formal advisor. You would help him develop his projects, provide alternative viewpoints on challenges he faces, and assist him in learning to think beyond traditional approaches." Jack felt his heart racing. "Your Majesty, I'm honored by your confidence, but I'm just a maintenance worker. I'm not qualified to advise the heir to an empire." "You are qualified by your results," Vexathara replied firmly. "In 2 weeks, you have helped my son develop more innovative thinking than his formal tutors managed in years. That suggests that your qualifications are more important than your credentials. But what about your advisors, your nobles? They won't accept advice from a human servant. Then they'll learn to, or they'll find themselves less relevant to future discussions." Vexathara's tone carried the absolute authority of someone accustomed to reshaping reality through sheer force of will. "The galaxy is changing, Jack Morrison. My empire will change with it, or it will be left behind. I would prefer to lead that change rather than be forced to react to it." As Jack walked back to his quarters that night, his head spinning with the day's developments, he couldn't help but think about the strange turns his life had taken. 3 years ago, he had been a stranded human engineer, grateful for any chance to survive in an alien empire. Now he was being asked to help shape the future of that empire by sharing the insights that came from his uniquely human perspective. The prince had learned to bloom where he was planted, and in doing so had created possibilities that none of them could have imagined. Perhaps that was the most human lesson of all, that sometimes the best way to find where you belong is to make the most of where you are and trust that growth and opportunity will follow. As he settled into sleep, Jack's last thought was about the conversation he would have with Kirion tomorrow. There was so much more to explore, so many possibilities to consider, and a young prince who was just beginning to understand the full scope of what he could accomplish when he combined the wisdom of his ancestors with the courage to ask new questions. The Zephyrian Empire was about to discover that sometimes the most revolutionary changes come not from conquest or force, but from the simple act of listening to voices you never thought to hear before. And Empress Vexathara had returned from the council more shocked than she ever could have imagined. not by what her human janitor had taught her son, but by what her son had taught himself when given the freedom to think in new ways.